Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm here to share my September wrap-up and reassert once more that time is very much fake. If I thought August was wild in terms of how much I read and what I read, September made me question my life even further because I somehow read 12 books. For some of you that's your norm, that is not mine. And that means we don't have time to waste, we don't have time to dilly-dally, so sit back, relax, and let's get into it. The first two books I read in September, thankfully I do not have to review here because I thoroughly discussed both of them in my last reading vlog, and those books were Just for the Summer by Abby Jimenez and I'll Have What He's Having by Adib Khorram. Spoiler alert, absolutely loved both of these and had such a great time reading them together. That vlog was fun to put together as well. It will be linked down below, so if you haven't seen it yet, you really should. After that vlog, I did a complete 180 in terms of genre and tone, and I decided to listen to The Night Guest by Hildur Knutsdottir, translated from the original Icelandic by Mary Robinette Kowal. Macmillan Audio kindly provided me with the audiobook, which is actually read by the translator herself. This is a horror novella set in Iceland about a woman dealing with chronic pain and fatigue, and she's been tirelessly cycling through doctors trying to figure out why she can't sleep. But so far everyone tells her that she's perfectly healthy and everything will get better if she simply implements some lifestyle changes. Unsurprisingly, none of those suggestions work, and the main character finds herself getting more and more exhausted even after falling asleep, and she's also finding strange injuries on herself upon waking. So one night she deliberately leaves her smartwatch on when she goes to bed, only to find out in the morning that she somehow walked 40,000 steps at night. Content warnings for experienced sexism and ableism, descriptions of chronic pain and fatigue, as well as bodily injury, mentions of sibling death, mentions of past infidelity, dead animals, mention of vomit, and some sexual content. This was a short but impactful story, very unsettling and intense. It makes great use of the novella structure, especially in utilizing short chapters and one-sentence chapters to continuously build suspense. There's also a great sense of push and pull throughout the story. There are moments where it's this very slow, simmering kind of story. We're following the main character through the mundane moments of her life, and then before you know it, a switch is flipped, and we're facing these horrific nighttime episodes. I mentioned this book in my video about books about women in translation, and in that video I speculated that I thought this story was going to use horror as a way to explore and express disability, especially the terrifying and isolating ordeal of ableism. And now, having read it, I think I was absolutely correct. I would very comfortably classify this story as disability horror. Through these inexplicable nighttime spells, the main character is very much facing a loss of control over her own body and by extension her health, because whatever entity she is unwillingly being party to is harming her body without her knowledge or consent. She's not in control of how she feels. She has no idea when the next strike is coming or how intense the damage might be. She's having to dramatically restructure her daytime life to accommodate for that pain and mask it from the other people around her who frankly wouldn't be able to understand. And it definitely makes you think about how the only kind of pain that's acceptable to express is the kind that has a clear and straightforward explanation or source. When you bring up pain or discomfort in conversation, people only care about things that have easy solutions. They want to believe that every inconvenience has an easy fix. And if there is no solution or end to your health issues, it's easier for people to then act like they simply don't exist. The unspoken consensus is that it's too inconvenient to make space for disability, which forces disabled people to then isolate themselves whether they want to or not. And that's what the main character is going through because she doesn't know who's going to believe her and who she can trust. So it's interesting to think about how the physical pain the main character is enduring compares to the emotional pain of losing these huge parts of her life. The ability to go to work on a daily basis, to spend time with her family, to date, to rest. I think the way the story utilizes horror as a metaphor for that commentary is incredibly smart and effective. And the underlying tension and mystery in the story helps to propel the reader towards the end. The ending is a little bit ambiguous, which is going to work for some readers and not for others. I do think it needed a little bit more backstory to get to where it wanted to go, but I do also appreciate how it puts the reader in the position to contemplate whether they believe what has been portrayed up to that point or whether they don't, which ties back into how the character is desperately searching for anyone to believe her experience. I thoroughly enjoyed my time with this, would definitely recommend. The audiobook is also really well done. Overall, I gave this 4.5 stars. After that, I was able to check off a huge 2024 checkmark from my list because I finally read A Master of Djinn by P. Djeli Clark. This is, so far, P. Djeli Clark's first and only full-length adult novel. It's a historical steampunk fantasy mystery set in an alternate version of Cairo in 1912. We're following investigator Fatma El Shawari, who we first meet in the novella A Dead Djinn in Cairo, which is the first of 3 supplementary prequel short works set in the Dead Djinn universe. In this version of Cairo, supernatural creatures and magical entities live alongside humans, but not always peacefully, which is why the Ministry of Alchemy, Enchantments, and Supernatural Entities was founded, and that's where investigator Fatima works. She is called to duty when a mysterious, powerful figure murders an entire secret brotherhood dedicated to Al-Jahiz, who is the man credited with breaking the seal between the supernatural world and the human world before mysteriously vanishing for decades. The murderer in question claims to be Al-Jahiz risen once again and put on a path of righteous vengeance to condemn the modern age for its injustices and oppressions, which not only endangers the people of Cairo, but also threatens to spill over onto the global stage. Content warnings for experienced racism and colorism, explorations of colonization and colonial violence, and graphic injury and violence. If you've been following my reading at all this year, the self-proclaimed year of P. Djeli Clark, then you will not be surprised when I say that I absolutely love this. This was my first chance to read something long form from P. Djeli Clark. He has published a couple of middle grade novels to date, but everything else and everything I've read so far has been a novella or a short story in the adult space. I've said it before, but he is an absolute master of the short form, and I was pleasantly validated to see that everything he does so incredibly well in the short form absolutely maps onto a longer form story. In fact, I think honing his short form technique actually makes this a better novel because he absolutely knows how to effectively structure and package his chapters, almost like their own short stories. And I just love everything he brings to the table. With this abundance of space, he's able to build out this really fascinating steampunk alternate Cairo and thoroughly explore the question of what a shared society between humans and supernatural creatures looks like. Fatima as a narrator is incredible. I loved her in the original novella, and I love her even more in this story. Her narrative voice is sharp and observant, but also a little bit wry, sarcastic, and humorous, and I think that combination really works. There's also a bit of an epic sapphic romance underpinning the conspiracy and mystery of the story, so that was also very fun to read. Speaking of the mystery, I was thoroughly engrossed from beginning to end. P. Djeli Clark knows how to structure and pace an incredibly gripping mystery. He knows how to keep you invested with each new lead, each new question, and all of his mystery-oriented stories are not just investigation-based, but also punctuated by these intense action sequences. There's really great character work in here as well. One of the main narrative threads is Fatima being forced to take on a bright-eyed, eager young partner as she's trying to crack this high-profile case. And I just found that relationship to be so endearing, especially as Fatima gradually and begrudgingly warms up to the idea and realizes that they might actually make a pretty good team. And most of all, I really appreciate what this story has to say about consciously divorcing ourselves from our preconceptions and expectations. In both a magical sense and a literal sense, the story has a lot to say about the dangers of falling prey to bias, of allowing ourselves only to see what it is we want to see and expect to see. It explores how our brains are conditioned to make the easiest assumption, the assumptions that already fit into the way we see the world, and how those preconceptions actually shape the way we interact with and experience the world around us. And that's really fascinating to think about, especially from the perspective of an investigator who's trained to be objective in what they observe and then be very logical and methodical in their analysis of those observations. But is there even such a thing as an objective version of the world in the first place? And this idea is explored in more than one way in the story. Like I mentioned, there's a sort of magical take on that concept. It also relates to the investigation itself, and it also connects to how the characters relate to each other on an interpersonal level. So I think it's brilliant to have that thematic concept reinforced in so many different ways. I still have so much more of P. Djeli Clark's work to read and enjoy, but he really can do no wrong in my eyes. This was an original, exciting, satisfying fantasy mystery story with so many cool pieces to it. I wholeheartedly recommend reading everything in the Dead Djinn universe, and I gave this 4.5 stars. Then I finally got a chance to pick up Compound Fracture by Andrew Joseph White. I was granted access to the audiobook by PRH Audio, and the audiobook is read by by one of my favorite narrators, Danny Martinek. This is a YA horror, thriller, slasher story about a trans autistic teenager named Miles who lives in a small West Virginian town that has been plagued by a vicious blood feud between his family and a prominent police family for generations. One night, Miles comes out to his parents, sneaks out to a party, and brings photographic evidence with him that might just turn the tide of this feud. Photos that prove that Sheriff Davies is responsible for a so-called accident that injured Miles' father and killed several others in the process. Miles is not only endangering his own life by trying to uncover the truth, but also the lives of his family and friends. And as things very quickly begin going downhill, he's also learning that there might be more folks than he originally thought who are ready to see the Davies reign of terror finally come to an end. Content warnings for experienced homophobia and transphobia, including dead naming, misgendering, and public outing, experienced ableism, descriptions of graphic violence and death, graphic mentions of animal death, instances of blood and gore, references to overdose, drug abuse, and drug addiction, and some instances of underage drinking and drunkenness. Also worth noting that besides being trans, queer, and autistic, Miles is also on the aromantic spectrum. Again, if you've been following my reading for any amount of time, you know I've been obsessed with Andrew Joseph White since Hell Followed With Us. I 100% vibe with his brand, and it's almost guaranteed that I will love anything he writes. Compound Fracture is absolutely no exception to that rule. I love that Andrew has such a clear voice and brand. His project is to validate and protect trans rage, which is so precious and so sacred, and I love his versatility in being able to come back to that idea through a horror lens, but never quite doing it the same way twice. This book is so different from his previous two. It does have some slight paranormal elements to it, but for the most part it's grounded in the real world and explores real world issues and consequences. It's also a chaotic, accidental slasher in some ways, which I think is really cool to bring to the YA space. That's not to say that YA slashers or thrillers don't already exist, but Andrew's take on it is just unfiltered and so far from palatable in the best possible way. His writing is gruesome, disgusting, in your face, pulls no punches, and as weird as it might be to say, I think we could use more of that. I appreciate how this story is committed to exploring the Appalachian region and parsing through things like Appalachian masculinity, regional politics, and the stereotype of insular communities through the lens of a young trans-mass character. The story talks about how the Appalachian region is stereotyped as red country, ultra-conservative, backwater, which may be true in some cases, but it's also populated by people willing and ready to fight against oppression, tyranny, and bigotry. It's one of those stories that reminds us that we exist everywhere. We being trans people, queer people, marginalized people, poverty-stricken people, radical people, liberation-oriented people. Even when we're overpowered or spoken over, we still have agency and we still exist. Ultimately, I think this is an incredibly striking story about a young trans character literally fighting tooth and nail just for the chance to live, which is the reality for so many queer and trans kids in the Appalachian region and in conservative states. Yes, Miles makes egregious mistakes. He hurts people, he enacts violence, he commits crimes, but ultimately he does all those things because there's a part of himself buried deep inside that desperately wants to live no matter what. And for him, fighting to protect that spark from going out is worth paying any cost. It's a story that reminds us that we can't begrudge the oppressed for how they choose to fight for their survival against their oppressors. Our anger, our outrage should be reserved for the systems and powers that be that force innocent people into a corner where every possible choice they have left to make is a bad choice. This is, once again, a story that makes use of darkness, hopelessness, and violence to excavate justice and catharsis in a very profound way. It also has a lot to say about finding your community and finding people who will take up the fight in your stead when you can't. I recommend this alongside all of Andrew Joseph White's books, and I gave it a very strong 4 stars. After that, and after hearing Reagan's glowing endorsement of this story, I decided to put a library hold on Where the Dark Stands Still by A.B. Poranek. This is a cozy YA fantasy with a heavy helping of romance. It's inspired by Polish history and folklore following a young girl named Liszka who has magic that she's never been able to control. And in her small Catholic village, she's been taught her entire life that magic is ungodly, unnatural, and dangerous. After unintentionally hurting one too many people in her life with her magical powers, she runs away from home one night in search of a mythical flower that's said to reside at the heart of the dark forest, and the the tales say that anyone who finds this flower will be granted one wish. Lishka obviously wants to use this wish to get rid of her magic, but before she can find the flower, she's caught by the demon warden of the forest and forced to bargain for her life by agreeing to spend 1 year of her life in service to him, and if she successfully completes her service, he will grant her wish. Content warnings for explorations of religious trauma and forced repression, experienced sexism and misogyny, some graphic injury, and some depictions of death. Also worth noting, the Lesha, the demon warden of the forest, is actually bisexual. Because why wouldn't he be? You're gonna hear people compare this to Beauty and the Beast, which I think is fair. I think there are some definite comparisons there. You'll hear it comped to other popular YA romanticises, but the only thing you need to know is that this book is basically A.B. Poranek's Polish take on Howl's Moving Castle, and it will make you feel like Howl's Moving Castle does. I need you to understand that I do not say that lightly. Howl's Moving Castle is perhaps my favorite movie and one of my favorite stories in the entire world. So when I tell you the vibes are 100% the same and that it's at that same level of quality and execution, I mean it. This was such a pleasant surprise. It's delightful, it's cozy, it's enchanting, it's magical and atmospheric. It has one of my favorite tropes, which is accidental domesticity, and to see that play out in this enchanted woodland manor presided over by a beautiful, tortured yet kind-hearted demon is just everything I want in life. The connection between Lishka and the Lesha is so incredibly beautiful. They couldn't be more different at first glance, but they're really two people who are fighting the same exact battle from two different ends. In their own ways, they're both struggling to gain an illusory sense of control in their lives. Lishka wants to control and quell her magic, which she's been taught to fear and hate and hide, but that's an unattainable goal because her magic is intrinsically a natural part of the world and a natural part of herself. The Lesha has taken on the burden of trapping demons in the woods and protecting humankind. He has his own magical related bargain that binds him to the forest, and he's determined to control all these evil forces by himself so that no one else gets hurt. The more time they spend together, the more they work together, the more they realize that they can set these burdens down and find a better way to exist that feeds their souls rather than depleting them, which I think is a really beautiful thing. It was such a magical, wonderful fantasy story, great elements of found family and self-discovery, commentary about overcoming religious trauma and becoming unafraid to stand in your power and your truth. I do wish Lishka's connection to her family and village had been a tad more fleshed out so that the ending was even more cathartic than it already was, but I absolutely adored this and I gave it 4.5 stars. Then Berkeley Romance kindly sent me an early finished copy of Lightning in Her Hands by Raquel Vasquez Gilliland, which comes out soon on October 15th. This is a mixture of fantasy, magical realism, and romance. It's the sequel/companion to Witch of Wild Things, and this installment is following the middle Flores sister Teal, who has magical dominion over the weather, but unfortunately she's not able to control it, so the weather around her often erratically changes based on her emotions. Part of her feels like she could master her magical abilities if she finally found her long-lost mother, but before she can do that, she's distracted by her ex-childhood best friend and longtime crush, Carter Velasquez. Carter agrees to be Teal's date to her ex's wedding in exchange for Teal pretending to be his wife so that his traditional Cuban grandmother will finally give him his inheritance. Teal agrees because with her cut of the money, she could finally afford to hire a private investigator. But of course, this whole fake marriage thing might not be the easy paycheck it seems. Content warnings for references to an absentee parent and experiences of child abandonment, multiple descriptions of past physical, verbal, and emotional abuse, experienced ableism and ableist language, and explicit sexual content. It's also worth noting that Teal has bipolar disorder and depression. I don't know that I have too much to say about this, so I'll try to keep it nice and short. I enjoyed this one. Raquel Vasquez Gilliland is always incredible no matter what she writes, and I've been thoroughly enjoying her foray into adult romance. I will say up front that I don't think this romance is quite as strong as the first book in the companion series, especially in terms of the relationship at the center. Childhood friends to lovers is a fantastic trope and always sweet and fun to read, but I think it's also deceptively simple and actually really hard to pull off. When there's an established relationship between characters that began far before the story ever started, it can be hard to catch the audience up to speed and make them authentically feel that intimate familiarity and the weight of all that shared history. And for me, for whatever reason, I never really got to that point of buying into that with these characters. That doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy them together or feel invested in their present day relationship dynamic. I did, but just that there was still space for even more emotional connection for me by the end. I think part of why I feel like that is because it seems like the story isn't quite sure what it wants to be. On the one hand, there's this deeply emotional storyline about Teal not being able to control her magic and how that's deeply rooted in the trauma from her mom's disappearance, but on the other hand, it's also trying to be this very straightforward, fake dating, fake marriage of convenience, and second chance romance. And don't get me wrong, I admire that the book doesn't feel the need to choose between the two, but at the same time, I'm not sure that it found that perfect middle ground to bridge the two concepts. But putting that aside, I still appreciate this story's willingness to explore hard-hitting topics like struggling with unhealthy coping mechanisms, being brave enough to not only ask for help but accept it when it's offered to you, and how trauma is often a communal experience that affects people in different ways. All of that is incredibly valuable, and I appreciate how the story gives Teal space to confront those things, and especially how her journey towards healing brings her closer to her sisters and reaffirms that she is surrounded by a loving family who supports her in everything she does, even in her mistakes. So overall, while I did personally find the romantic relationship to be a bit lacking and the oscillation between tropey romance and family drama to be a little rough around the edges, I still enjoyed this and I look forward to reading the next installment. I gave this 3.5 stars. This next book is one I actually started at the end of August and strategically tricked my brain into slow reading over the course of 22 or 23 days, and that was The Bright Sword by Lev Grossman. I listened to the sensational audiobook courtesy of Pure Age Audio, which is read by Nicholas Guy Smith. This is a historical fantasy and Arthurian retelling that actually follows a young knight, Cullum of the Outer Isles, as he finally journeys to Camelot to compete for a spot on the Round Table. However, when he finally arrives there, he learns that he's too late. King Arthur tragically died 2 weeks before at the Battle of Camlan, leaving no heir behind and only a handful of not-so-famous knights at the Round Table in his stead. All the well-known knights have either died or dispersed. So Cullum pretends to be from a noble bloodline so he can join the knights' ranks, and together, along with Merlin's apprentice, Nimue, the ragtag group of knights set out on a journey to somehow find a new king and hopefully rebuild Camelot. Content warnings for death, violence, mentions of experienced child abuse and bullying, animal death, experienced ableism, experienced transphobia, dysphoria, and outing, brief non-graphic references to rape and attempted rape, some internalized ableism and ableist language, and brief references to both self-harm and suicide. I have never read anything by Lev Grossman, and I have no interest in reading any of his other books that have been published up to this point, so this was kind of a wild card for me, and I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about it, but I love Arthurian stories and retellings, and surprisingly, this might just be one of the best. I feel so much fondness towards this story, I think because of how I consumed it across such a large swath of time, but even dipping in and out of it so inconsistently, I always felt like the story welcomed me back with open arms. And the characters are so distinctive and strangely endearing that it always felt like a joy returning to them. Every time I came back to the story, I always fell back into it so easily as if I never missed a beat. I could always perfectly remember what was happening when I last left off, and I think that's the mark of a story that's been told so incredibly successfully, which feels so weird to say when this book is almost 700 pages and could have gone so wrong so easily, so many times in so many ways. I think this is such a fun, original take on the Knights of the Round Table. This idea that the only knights remaining are the weird nobodies who end up having to save the kingdom from destruction without having any idea what they're doing is just such a great concept. What I really respect about this story is that it's somehow able to perfectly toe this line between being silly, goofy, utterly ridiculous, and completely unserious, while at the same time carrying exactly the right amount of gravitas for a group of leaderless knights whose belief in their empire and their fallen king has irrevocably been shaken from its foundations. Because that's what the story is about. It's about an empire that has finally fallen into ruin without the one person who kept it all together. And now that there's no king, there's no heir, there's no system of power, there's no precedent for what comes next, what is going to happen to the ruins and the people who are left? And it's that awareness that takes what could have just been a satirical story about a ragtag group of knights in a stereotypical Arthurian romp to a deeply profound fantasy adventure about reckoning with the consequences of empire and idolatry and asking where the conflation of personal identity and country ultimately leaves us. That's why Callum and the other knights are trying so desperately to recreate the quests of old, searching for a miracle, searching for some all-knowing power that will magically announce a new ruler, like what happened when Arthur pulled the sword from the stone. And the not knowing of it all is what causes them to realize their commitment to Arthur's empire is ultimately worthless. It doesn't provide answers, it doesn't provide guidance, it's a force that only feeds and serves itself. And they're forced to admit to themselves that the ruler and the kingdom they once thought were infallible and unquestionably just are actually much more broken than they ever thought. On a different note, I also really love the structure of the story. You're following the present-day adventures of these remaining knights of Camelot, but it's broken up by flashback chapters for each of the knights, showing where they came from when they joined the table and why they pledged Arthur their allegiance. I loved that device so much because it makes you feel much more emotionally grounded in this cast of characters. Where they start off in the beginning as strangers and unknowns, they eventually begin to feel like friends. But most importantly, I love what this story has to say about fearlessly facing down the unknown, accepting that there's always more to yourself and more to the world that you've yet to learn, and how the greatest and most perilous adventure of all is moving forward. I don't think this book is perfect by any means. It does have some moments of gratuitous misogyny for one thing, I felt, and I'm sure it could have been stronger in a myriad of ways. But at the end of the day, I just feel in my heart that it's a clear 5 stars. After that, one of my besties finally succeeded in bullying me to read one of their favorite books, which is Vespertine by Margaret Rogerson. I ended up doing a hybrid read with the audiobook, which is read by Caitlin Davies. This is a standalone YA fantasy book about Artemisia, an orphan with a tragic past who's training to be a Grey Sister, which is a nun who magically cleanses the bodies of the deceased so their souls can pass on to the afterlife. However, the spirits that linger in the mortal world are often not peaceful ones, and in fact, Artemisia's convent is attacked by a legion of possessed soldiers, which forces her to awaken an ancient spirit bound to a saint's relic. This spirit is known as a revenant, which is a malevolent being that could easily possess her and snuff out her life. Wielding its power actually almost kills her, but she knows that the country's only chance of stopping this growing wave of undead spirits is for her to do the unthinkable and work with the revenant to combine their powers over death. Content warnings for references to PTSD and past instances of self-harm, descriptions of child neglect, experienced bullying and ableism, some instances of vomit, and descriptions of severe illness. Also, even though this is a high fantasy story that doesn't use the same language or labels as we do, Artemisia is still very much some flavor of neurodivergent. This is basically like a YA fantasy take on Venom, which I'm absolutely all about. It has so many things that aesthetically are 100% my jam. Death nuns, dark religious magic, possession, snarky demons, and unveiling deeply held conspiracies. The strongest part of this story by far is the relationship between Artemisia and her revenant. Their connection is like a violent, dark twist on the forced proximity trope, but in a platonic sense. I love begrudging allies turned friends, and this story absolutely delivers in that sense. There's also an irony in their relationship because Artemisia keeps to herself, has no love for the people around her, struggles to see herself as someone worth taking care of, but once the revenant is sharing her body, it changes the entire way she carries herself through the world. Suddenly she has this entity in her body and her mind that knows so much about her whether she wants it to or not, and who's actually holding her accountable to recognizing her limitations and her needs, especially because the revenant depends on her to actually take care of the vessel they both share. And when she comes to understand the tremendous power they both have together and the consequences of that power, she realizes that she will need help from other people in order to get to the bottom of this conspiracy she uncovers, and that depending on other people is not a weakness. I said this before about Asunder, but I love when a curmudgeonly character reluctantly collects more and more people as their journey progresses, and that's definitely what you get with this story. I just had a good time with this story overall. It's a dark and twisted fantasy adventure with a satisfying mystery at the center. It's action-packed. It has a unique magic system that has an interesting relationship to religion. There were also twists and turns that kept me guessing until the very end. I do oddly kind of feel like we got more world building than was strictly necessary for the scope scope of this standalone story, which kind of left me wanting more in some ways, but I don't think that's inherently a bad thing, and I still gave this 4 stars. For September, my patrons wanted me to read my first Gavino Iglesias book, so at their behest, I finally picked up The Devil Takes You Home by Gavino Iglesias. This is a unique genre mashup of crime thriller, horror, mystery, and even magical realism. The story is about a Puerto Rican-American man named Mario who unfortunately loses his daughter to childhood cancer, leaving him not only drowning in grief, but also severe medical debt. After his daughter passes, his marriage is also effectively destroyed, culminating in his wife leaving him and moving back in with her parents. In his desperation to pay off his debt, Mario reluctantly begins taking jobs as a hitman and surprises even himself with his proclivity for violence. And now that his life is in ruins, he agrees to one last job that could potentially set him up for life. But the job is to hijack a cartel's cash shipment before it reaches Mexico, and now Mario is putting his life and his trust in a cartel insider and a temperamental drug addict to finish the job. But either way, even if he makes it back alive, he will not return as the same man he once was. Content warnings for parents with drug addiction, drug use and abuse, including withdrawal symptoms, depictions of childhood cancer, child death and grief, graphic violence, murder and mutilation, some domestic violence, brief references to suicidal ideation, some transphobia, experienced racism, including racial slurs, and some instances of animal violence and death. Like I said, this was my first Gavino Iglesias book, and it was absolutely wild. People often describe him as being the Latine S.A. Cosby, which is honestly extremely high praise because S.A. Cosby knows how to write one hell of a book that will leave you questioning absolutely everything, and I have to say I think that comparison is well earned and makes a lot of sense. This was some of the most horrific, disgusting, gruesome, violent content I've read in quite some time, and yet somehow it doesn't feel gratuitous. And I think that's in part because the kinds of violence the story is committed to exploring are very much grounded in realism, in real horrific experiences that are happening as we speak. Whether that's border and immigration violence, gun violence, child abuse, or weaponized religiosity, the story is really subjecting us to the kinds of discomfort we'd rather not face. And I think it also works within the framework of the story because it's tempered with this surrealist slant. These moments where Mario has what he calls waking visions, where he sees demons or creatures or things that may or may not be there. And so that makes you question what's objectively real and what's not. It becomes a question of how much of this is Mario's guilt, grief, and pain finally spilling over from his body to the world around him. How much horror is he willing to witness and inflict upon others in this desperate search for peace. It's definitely a nihilistic story. It's told from the point of view of someone who's experienced a profound kind of loss, who's become disconnected from everything and everyone in his life, who can't bring himself to see the world as something that can ever be redeemed. And it's purposely told from that place of hopelessness. I think it also has interesting things to say about masculinity, specifically machismo, how men are drawn to violence as a proxy for intimacy, the lengths they're willing to go to in order to validate themselves as protectors and providers, their investment in crafting the fiction of this ultra self-reliant man who can make his own way when it seems like there are no paths left to take. And I was also especially taken with the story's exploration of religious fanaticism and weaponized religiosity. I think it's really interesting how religion, specifically Catholicism, was a constant force throughout the story, whether Mario was on the good side of things or the bad side of things. And it really shows how religion, again specifically Catholicism and Christianity, becomes a catch-all for any situation, how it can easily be misused and manipulated to make even the worst of choices seem moral or justified, how it can be used as justification to commit the worst kinds of violence and atrocities. And because, like I said, the story is told from an incredibly nihilistic perspective, it also shows how isolated you can really become when you stop putting your faith in other people. Having faith in yourself is important, of course, but that alone is not enough to sustain us. I'm honestly still chewing this one over because a lot happens in the story and there's so much to process, but I think Gavino Iglesias absolutely nails the voice of this character. The pacing is tight, the structure is incredibly effective, every single second of the story feels treacherous, not just up to the end, but through the end, which is so hard to pull off. I think I would rate this one somewhere around 4 stars. Then on a whim, I decided to pick up Graveyard Shift by ML Rio. I listened to the audiobook, which is read by Jess Nahikian, Si Chen, Susan Dalian, Tim Campbell, and Max Meyer. Myers. This is a suspenseful mystery thriller novella that takes place over the course of a single night. It follows a ragtag group of insomniacs/night shift workers who meet at the local cemetery every night for a shared cigarette break. One night they arrive to find a freshly dug open grave, and they begin to wonder who dug it and what or who is the grave meant for in the first place. Content warnings for depictions of dead animals and some internalized ableism and use of ableist language. I had a pretty good time listening to this. I think it's a fun, intriguing, dark little mystery that doesn't overstay its welcome and makes great use of some interesting narrative pieces, especially in terms of character work. Not to brag, but I've now read all of ML Rio's books, which isn't saying much because there's only the two, but just from the two books I've read, I can see that she really thrives in writing these intricate group dynamics, especially with more than 2 or 3 characters. She knows how to write witty banter, she knows how to establish a group's rapport and connect together all these opposing experiences in interesting ways. That's why it makes perfect sense that once more she's centering a dark mystery around a ragtag, unlikely group of heroes and just really having fun in that space. I found every perspective in the story to be distinctive and engaging, and even though it seems like it's just a random group of strangers at first glance, it's interesting to see how some of them are more connected than you would think. And I also just love that trope where a character isn't the best at what they do or might not even have an especially unique skill in the first place, but ultimately ends up putting that one skill to perfect use, and the story has that in spades. None of these characters are especially prolific at what they do, none of them are prodigies or standouts in their respective fields, but they all somehow have exactly the right niche skill to help them get to the bottom of this mystery, which requires them to combine their very strange forces. I vibe with that kind of crew, it's just always fun to read. The mystery itself is also relatively straightforward, but has some interesting twists and turns throughout, even within a condensed space. I didn't get anything profound from the story, which is not a requirement by any means. I think it's just a cool, creepy, vibey little mystery. It's a story that's meant to entertain and entice, and I think it does. I will say though, I don't think the mystery is as satisfying as it could be by the end. Thankfully, I only just read If We Were Villains for the first time in August, so I didn't have to wait all that long to read something new from this author, but I think if I had to wait 10 years for ML Rio to write something new and then I got this, I might be disappointed. For me, this was just a solid 3.5 stars. Finally, as if all that wasn't enough, I also decided to squeeze in my galley of Model Home by River Solomon. My review copy was kindly sent to me by MCD Books, and it also recently just came out on October 1st. This is River Solomon's take on a haunted house story. It's about the 3 Maxwell siblings who were forced to grow up in a sinister house just outside of Dallas. When their family first moved into this gated community, they were the only Black family in the neighborhood. But while their neighbors acted polite and pleasant, strange and horrific things began happening inside their house. When the siblings grew up, they moved far away from that house, leaving their parents to live there alone. But when they receive word that their parents have both passed away, they're forced to return to that old house and reckon with the past. Content warnings for explorations of death and grief, references to dissociative and depressive episodes, brief instances of vomit, mentions of disordered eating, references to animal death, explorations of racism, experienced ableism, internalized ableism, and references to ableist abuse, brief references to past suicide attempt, use of homophobic slurs, references to rape, and explicit sexual content. Also worth noting, Esri, the main character, is gender fluid, gender queer. They're also autistic, diabetic, and have multiple disabilities. Their daughter is also autistic and diabetic. This book goes so hard from the very first page, and it just wraps its hands around your throat and doesn't let go until the very end. River Solomon is one of my favorite authors. I've loved everything they've written so far, and this book is no exception. I kind of put them in the same tier of author as Silvia Moreno Garcia, not because they write similar things or even produce the same volume of things, but because they're both genre chameleons who rarely, if ever, write the same kind of story twice. Not to mention whatever genre they decide to try on, they absolutely smash. I love this take on a haunted house story so much. It's so different than what you would expect when you hear haunted house, in the sense that it's not just a montage of strange or unsettling ongoings in this house. It's not a series of flashbacks. It's not even primarily set in the house. And yet you feel the far-reaching presence of the house on every single page, whether the characters are physically contained within it or not. And the metaphor of a haunted house, of being trapped or harmed in a place that's meant to be safe, can be used in so many different ways. And in this case, the house almost represents the characters' childhoods. Then the question becomes, what must it be like to be forever trapped inside a childhood defined by violence, insecurity, and injustice. Especially for these three siblings who grew up having horrible, inexplicable things happening to them inside this house, but never being able to get their parents to protect them or believe them in the first place. If that was your childhood, that would be a terrible place to be trapped, either physically or psychologically. And what I think this story does incredibly well is to redefine the usual trappings of a haunted house as symptoms of trauma. What is a haunting if not a violent recreation or resurfacing of the past? What is possession if not despair, pain, and trauma forcefully inhabiting and overpowering the body? The story also explores the complicated relationship the Maxwell siblings had with their parents, especially in terms of race, class, and conformity, and really how their parents' undying loyalty to the American dream and this image of being a successful Black family in America outweighed whatever responsibility they felt they had towards their kids. That's another layer of trauma in their shared childhood. Not only the fact that their parents wouldn't believe their experiences, but also the lengths they would go to in order to keep up this facade of perfection and success no matter the cost. And those expectations in so many ways have also haunted them throughout their lives. There's also nuance in the story for accounting for the three siblings' completely different experiences and interpretations of their childhoods and their experiences in the house. I really appreciate that. It makes the story more complex and throws even more question marks into the mix because it's hard to tell which of them, if any of them, have an objective view on everything they experienced. The writing in this story alone is absolutely stunning. There's so much to consider. There's so much to think about. There are so many fascinating ways the story shapeshifts as it progresses towards the end. There is a reveal that happens towards the end that didn't quite land for me, and truthfully, I'm still interrogating why that is. Obviously, I'm not going to say anything more specific, but I will say that for me, it took what had been a very clear 5-star book from the very first sentence on the very first page down a slight notch. But this is still a new favorite. I highly recommend it, and I gave it 4.5 stars. So those are all the books I somehow read in September. Reading-wise, at least, I absolutely cannot complain about anything. If you've read any of these books yourself, or if you plan to, I would love to hear your thoughts down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.